On our most recent episode of Denzinger's Dilemmas, which you can find linked in the description below, we had talked about Catholic education, emphasizing the words of Pope Pius XI in his encyclical Divini Ilius Magistri. And in that episode, we had featured a short excerpt of an interview with Mr. Mark Langley, the academic dean of the Lyceum, a small classical Catholic school in South Euclid, Ohio. And so what follows now is the entirety of that exclusive interview. Mr. Langley had some enormous insight into the very idea of education, some analysis of the present-day crisis in Catholic education, and some other great nuggets of human wisdom. We think you'll love what he has to say. So please give our video a thumbs up and maybe even subscribe to the channel. So without further ado, grab yourself some popcorn and maybe a cold beer and enjoy this particularly candid content.
I love the whole discussion about what the end of education is. Any Catholic educator who has not read the encyclical Divini Ilius Magistri, Pius XI's encyclical, in my opinion, that's the single greatest statement about Christian education. And not just about Christian education, but it's also, Pius XI, he also manages to talk about education even in the natural sense. So when he says in that famous paragraph that the end of Christian education is to take into account the nature of man and ultimately his ultimate end, which is the vision of God. That right there is the clue to the end of Christian education. The Christian education is to form students in such a way that they're disposed to encounter the vision of God. But do you see? So the Pope there, he immediately talks about the final end, which is the governing end, and that should govern all of the thoughts of the educator. So what does that mean concretely? That means that the entire school, the entire curriculum, every effort that a educator makes has to take into account the final end of man. So that, for me, that's an extremely powerful. That's a powerful clue and a powerful guide, because as any good Aristotelian knows, the end, the final cause, is the thing to which we have to look in order to guide all of our decisions, all of our curriculum planning, anything that we do with students in any of the arts or sciences has to be governed by forming the student so that he's disposed for his final end, the vision of God. I keep repeating that, but I think that's it bears repeating. So when Pius XI says that the end of Christian education is to prepare man for his ultimate end, I think he starts his encyclical off. That's fairly early in the encyclical. Then he's able to write his entire encyclical and draw many conclusions from that. Just for example, so in the scholastic view of education, all of the arts and sciences would serve theology. So theology is the queen of the sciences. That's the view that Pius XI is talking about. He's talking about schools and curriculum and education, all at the service of theology, the Regina Scientiarum, as we like to say. So I think that's the end of education and the end of Christian education. one more thing. In some sense, I shy away from the phrase Christian education because I can't really see education apart from that end. It seems to me that Christian education is almost redundant. That what else is education other than preparing man for his final end? Of course, Christianity and through the revealed doctrines of our faith gives a special illumination about that end. But in my opinion, there really is no difference between education and Christian education. As far as I'm concerned, all education is ordered to the beatific vision. The essence of an authentic education, in my view, has everything to do with tradition. Of course, any good Latin student knows that tradition from trado, tradere, is it tradisti or tradidi?
Tradidi.
Tradidi, traditum. It means to hand down, to give across. Maybe from transdo, transdare, to hand across. But there's this idea that in the formation of the mind, the thing we want to avoid is continually reinventing the wheel. As if every generation has to come up with its own way of discovering the truth. Or imagine if everyone had to, if every generation had to make all of the discoveries that scientists have made, or everyone had to rediscover the Pythagorean theorem. So education, by its nature, is something which is rooted in tradition, and we can see the catastrophic consequences that happen when people abandon tradition. I'm just talking about secular education. When you abandon the traditions of the past, the sort of the traditions of our Greco-Roman Western Christian culture. When we abandon that, then we can see that the mind suffers, and the formation of students. We can, maybe that's a subject for another time, but so right now we're facing the consequences of an abandonment of tradition. But it's interesting that the Catholic Church is par excellence the organization that is sort of that is founded and wrapped up in tradition. That the church itself is sort of a guardian, and it's a guardian of tradition, and any pious Catholic or pious Christian is naturally going to have a reverence for tradition. So in other words, education and tradition go hand in hand. The question about the relationship between the Catholic culture and education is an excellent thing to think about, because when we think about the Catholic Church, when we think about what that means, culture, the culture of the church, we're thinking about the idea that the church itself is sort of the guardian of tradition. As Pius XI says in his encyclical, the church, it belongs distinctly and primarily to educate. When Christ told the apostles, "Go out and teach all nations," the church is given a mandate of educating. So this idea that the church is not only has the mandate to educate, but also is the guardian of the arts, and is the guardian of, and it's the guardian of the sciences. It's the guardian of education. I think history bears that out. The great Renaissance through Saint Benedict and his monasteries, just guarding the thought of the ancients and developing the. I'm thinking of all of those monks in their cells, copying down scripture and through the dark times in history. They're actually some of my favorite times in history. But so at any rate, the idea that in my view, it seems like the church is exemplifies the whole idea of handing down what is the pearls that have been discovered by saints and by scholars, and the church has always kept those in a treasury and made them available to the world. So I guess in short, there's the connection between Catholic culture and education is absolutely there's a firm bond between the two. I think Pius XI has particularly in mind the idea that, when he says that the end of education is to produce the Christian that is disposed to the vision of God, which is ultimately what he's saying. I think it goes with that, and maybe he says this explicitly somewhere, that clearly the ultimate act that any human being can perform is the fitting and proper worship of God. That act, especially through the holy sacrifice of the Mass, appears to be the ultimate act that any human being can perform, that act of worship. And so, if we think about education as ultimately ordered to developing human beings that can perform that action, that consummate human action, the fitting worship of God, then we can see that Catholic culture is absolutely pivotal to education. That, and it's so clear to me that if the end of man is really finally worship, and I'm thinking especially at say Mass, to participate in the Mass, and to which even in the canon somewhere it says it should be reasonable and fitting and dignum et justum est. So to have a human being, to be able to form a human being that is able to engage in that action, is in my mind the end of education. In some way, this might seem kind of ridiculous when you first hear it, but when someone is sitting in a math class in geometry, or someone sitting in a science class, and I mean studying something like the insect world through the lens of Jean-Henri Fabre, the French entomologist who is a wonderful Catholic. Those scientists and those something like Euclidean geometry are very tied to developing the human soul in such a way that it's able to become more rational and ultimately to engage in a rational act of worship. It seems like a pretty distant connection. What does studying Euclidean geometry have to do with going to Mass? In my view, it has everything has everything to do with going to Mass. That the end of all of the individual courses, whether you're taking Latin or reading Shakespeare or you're reading Herodotus or any of these things, memorizing poetry, these are all about forming the soul with the right kind of culture that allows him to participate in the Mass, which is sort of the culminating action. This is a hard concept for me to communicate, but in other words, I see everything as being dispositive. The Greeks had a word, it's called propedeutic, that everything that the educator does is propedeutic, it's dispositive. It disposes the student for the act of worship. So that's why the entire curriculum at a Catholic school or at any school, when they talk about it being integrated, they mean, does each part of the curriculum develop the human soul in the way that it needs to be developed, such that it can engage in a fitting and proper and rational worship? So that's kind of a difficult idea, I think, but it seems to me that Pius XI is ultimately getting at that. He always mentions in the encyclical, you'll always find that this idea that grace builds on nature. And he says that. He says Christian education is not trying to put down secular learning, as if the Catholic school or the Christian educator doesn't need to pay attention to the so-called secular sciences or arts. He says he says those have everything to do. Developing all of the things all of the knowledge that we have from nature, that's all something which grace can build upon and assume or perfect. In this regard, I'm reminded of Tertullian's famous question: "What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem?" But he's trying to get at that idea. What does the world of natural knowledge that Aristotle or even Boethius talks about when he talks about mathematics, physics, and metaphysics, just in a natural, those are the sciences. What do those have to do with theology? What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? And St. Thomas Aquinas and the Catholic Church and Pius XI, who keeps calling Aquinas the angelic doctor, they say that all of those things have everything to do with developing the soul, the reason, the will, the imagination, the intellect, the emotions, disposing them all for the worship of God. So Catholic culture and education are intertwined inseparably. Today we're in the midst of an enormous crisis, a collapse with respect to Catholic education. I think a total collapse in which pretty much the Catholic schools everywhere are inconsistent with the norms that Pius XI has set forth. To me, it's obvious that the Catholic schools everywhere are struggling with their Catholic identity. They're struggling with this idea that the Church has a culture that it needs to plug into in order to enliven their mission as a Catholic school. And I think this problem started, I'm sure it started, people could argue about what is the root of this collapse. But one significant event happened in our country in 1967. The president of Notre Dame, this is just over 50 years ago, the president of Notre Dame, the leading Catholic university in the United States of America, of enormous influence. They got together with a number of other Catholic educators, influential educators, and in Land O'Lakes, Wisconsin. And they put forth a statement called the Land O'Lakes Statement, which sort of redefined the goal and the mission of the Catholic University in America. The central theme that they put forth, and they signed their names to this. This is Father Hesburgh and these leading Catholic educators. They signed a statement in which they essentially said the Catholic university should be free from the authority of the Catholic Church, and it no longer needs to. It should have, and they use the phrase academic freedom. You know, there's the sacrosanct idea is that a university should have a sense of complete freedom, and so they wanted to develop a modern. They wanted to make Catholic universities and colleges fully modern. This is the term they use. You know, they wanted to, and so the significance of that statement was that they lost this idea that all of Catholic education is supposed to be tied to theology, the queen of the sciences. All of Catholic education is ultimately supervised, or I should say, is ultimately under the rulership or the guidance of the Church. This idea that Pius XI lays down in the encyclical is that since the Church has the primary mandate of education from Christ himself, and since the Church is the mother, you know, it's mater et magistra, then the Church is sort of in the position to be the arbiter and the judge. So in the Father Hesburgh and his colleagues, I think saw that as sort of embarrassing when they're trying to compete with these secular universities. You know, when they're trying to compete with the Ivy Leagues. I think there was a sense that the Ivy League schools would not take them seriously if they still if they still avowed their Catholic identity in terms of, you know, obedience to to Rome. And now I don't want to misstate that. I think they still think of themselves as being obedient to Rome. But the idea is that they thought that every department in the university should be free to ask any question. There should be no banned books. That's in their statement. There should be no banned books. There should be a complete liberty to investigate in any way they chose, and in any way which seemed appropriate to the professors. And so the reason why I'm talking about this is that with such influential educators making an open effort to become sort of more secular, this had a sort of trickle-down effect on every school, every Catholic school in America, so that it's no wonder that you start seeing schools taking down crucifixes or trying to, in some ways, you might not know they're Catholic. There might be some Catholic schools where a student might attend, and it may be unclear to him that he's attending a Catholic school. You can see the complete breakdown, the disintegration of the curriculum. Instead of all sciences, arts, and disciplines being ordered to theology as sort of the queen, now we have this sort of cafeteria-style curriculum that you have in Catholic schools. In other words, there's really no difference now between a Catholic school and a secular school. I would say Catholic schools might still have superior teachers. Maybe there's an advantage in attending them, but in a way you might say they appear to be Catholic in name only now. So I think if you visited a conventional Catholic school, and I won't name names here, I'm not, we don't want to beat up on any particular school, but for the most part, I think Catholic schools have adopted the same curriculum, the same biology, chemistry, physics, the same the same reading lists, and the same mathematics, and the same sports programs, and that the public schools have adopted, and then they've said, oh, but we also have religion. So it's sort of a veneer of Catholicism, as opposed to this other idea that Pius XI is setting forth, that a Catholic school ought to be every part of the Catholic school, including the lunch period, and including every part of the Catholic school and every part of a student's day is ultimately ordered to disposing him to the vision of God. That's Pius XI. So we are experiencing this total and absolute collapse of Catholic education in our country, and I don't see how it can be rectified until the Land O'Lakes statement is completely rejected and renounced, and until Catholic universities begin to rediscover their identity. Yeah, the quote from Land O'Lakes, he says, here's a quote from it. It says, the Declaration of the Independence of Catholic Universities from, quote, authority of whatever kind, lay or clerical. You know, we have independence from authority of every kind. I mean, that's what you know. It's like non serviam. You know,